If you want to color along with the same inks I'm going to be using in this video, you can download them in the link in the description, along with a few other ink drawings that I've made that you can take and use to practice your coloring. Every artist has a different process for how they do their coloring or painting. Today I'm going to take you through my personal process that I use to make art that looks like all of this. And while I really like how this process works for me, and I hope it works well for you as well, I recommend that you experiment a lot with your coloring process. Try adding different steps, taking different steps away, and just rework it until you find something that really works for you. Also, I'm personally going to be using Sketchbook Pro for this tutorial, and you can download it in the link in the description. I really like it, it's a free software, but most of the stuff that I'm talking about in this video can be done in pretty much any drawing software. Without further ado, let's get into coloring this drawing of Scarlet Spider versus the Juggernaut. You should always start by planning out your piece. You should go into it having a good understanding of what your intentions are. For this one, I know that I want the core of the piece to be a red triangle. Gonna go from a very gray red and get more and more vibrant as we go up that triangle, and Scarlet Spider is going to be our main focus. I also know that I'm gonna make the sky in the background a bit of a greenish blue so that the red really stands out against it. You should also make sure you know what your lighting source or lighting sources are for this piece. For this one, I know the main lighting source is going to be in the upper right corner of the piece, as if you were looking at it from the character's perspective, it would be in front of them to the left. So from the way we're looking at it, the lighting would be coming from the right. I also know that I plan on adding a bit of some kind of lighting streak texture in the background behind them, which I'll probably use to justify some rim lighting coming in from behind the characters. For this piece, I'll also be using 6 different brushes and erasers. If you want the actual settings that I'm using for these brushes, I'll put them up on screen now and you can pause, but there's nothing particularly special about them. Here's the breakdown of the brushes I'll be using. One is just a hard-edged paintbrush. There's not really any texture to it, it's just a regular old paintbrush. Then, we've got an airbrush of some kind. Again, nothing that special about it, just an airbrush. Then, I've got a thinner hard-edged brush that you don't really necessarily need. You could just shrink down the size of the hard-edged paintbrush when you need it, but figure there's no downside in having both. Then you'll want a blending or smudging brush, something that can kind of soften out some harder lines. Then you'll want a soft-edged eraser so that you can erase out some sections of shadow and then add shadowing detail inside of those shadows. And finally, just a regular hard-edged eraser for, fixing mistakes and stuff like that. So with all that set up and ready to go, we can get into step 2 where we actually start to color. Now, if you're using the project that I provided, you'll see that there's currently 3 layers. The top layer of inks, which you should just not touch that one. A layer of textures, which is just a bit of texturing on the ground. And then the last and bottom layer is a duplicated layer of inks that you're going to do the flatting in. And flatting is the process of laying down your base layer of colors that you'll start building the form and shape and shadow and lighting on top of later on. The way that I personally do my flatting layer is with the wand tool and gradients. So using the wand tool and sometimes the lasso tool, I'll block out sections that should all be about the same color and then add in a gradient to that section. Usually, if I'm doing something like a layer of red, I'll do a gradient going from a more vibrant red to a more desaturated red, or maybe a reddier red to a more purpley red. It depends on the piece and what's going on in the background and what the general color of the piece is. But basically, to lay down the flat colors, I'm doing lots of slight gradients on the piece, keeping in mind what I was planning in the first place, the ground being most desaturated, getting a bit more saturated and bright as we go up that triangle. You'll also see that I've made separate layers to do the flatting for the ground and the background. That's not something I always do, but if I'm spending a bit longer on a piece and I want to give myself a bit more creative freedom as I go along, I'll do something like that, because then I can tweak the colors of different sections of the image more easily. But with the flatting coming to an end, let's take a look at how this looks without any of the shadowing and lighting put on it. Now we're getting into actually doing some shadowing, which will get some depth to the piece. And to do this, I start by making a new layer on top of the flatting layer, but beneath the inking layer, and I change the blending mode to multiply. And then I'll also usually bring down the opacity to maybe 75 or 80% for that layer, and then using a color based off of something in the environment of the piece. For this piece, because the background is a blue color, I use a very, very dark blue to start laying in some really thick shadows. And I go over the top here because I know I'm gonna take out shadowing later on in later steps. So basically anywhere I think there should be a bit of shadow, I just lay on with my hard paintbrush a thick layer of shadowing. And I'm not fading my lines at all, I'm keeping it very cell shaded, so everything is very sharp and very cartoony looking at this stage. It'll get more smoothed out as we go along, but for now, you're just laying in the base shadows. Also, you'll notice I've made 3 different multiply layers, and I'm doing 3 different layers of shadowing. One for Juggernaut, one for Scarlet Spider, and one for the ground. Again, this isn't something I always do, but if I'm spending longer on a piece, then I'll do it just to make sure I have more creative freedom as I go along if I want to bring up the shadows on one character but not another, and stuff like that. But with the first layer of shadows coming to an end, we can move on to the next shadowing step. Now this next layer of shadowing is probably one of my favorite parts. What I do here is on those same shadowing layers that we've made, I take the soft-edged eraser and brush out some of the shadows, mostly in sections that I think would be a little bit brighter. I tend to leave alone the parts where there would be the darkest level of shadows, but I am pretty liberal with this. And I'm not taking out the shadow completely, I'm just making it lighter in sections, because then what you can do on those same layers is add back in some shadows to give it some extra detail. So for things like forearm muscles, or little ridges in the suit, or abs, or just little bevels, or even veins, you're adding an extra layer of detailing to the shadows that I think just looks really nice. And you'll also notice in some areas on this one, I'm taking the blending brush or smudging brush, and I'm kind of smudging some of the sharper lines on areas where the character should be a little bit more rounded. For instance, Juggernaut's bicep, I don't want it to look too boxy, and leaving the shadowing lines very sharp can make something look like it's pretty blocky. So if you brush out that line a little bit, smudge it a bit, smooth out the shadow, it can give it a rounder feel. So I do that on areas like his bicep, on Juggernaut's head a bit because it's very round, some parts of Spider-Man's arms and legs. And the more you brush this out and smoothen out those lines, the less cartoony a piece will start to look. I personally like my pieces looking decently cartoony, so I don't do too much of this, but that'll really come down to personal preference. Now for lighting, I start by making a new layer and changing the blending mode to glow. I'm not sure if all drawing softwares have glow as a blending mode option, but I think it's pretty similar to an add layer in something like Photoshop, so if you're not using Sketchbook Pro, you can make the blending mode add for this section. Anyway, for this, I don't do the base level of light the same way that I did the shadows. What I do is I take the lasso tool and block off sections where I want some lighting, and then use my light airbrush and brush in light, adding it heavier on sections that are closer to the main lighting source. So on this piece, the parts that are a little bit more to the right of the characters. And if I want a more intense level of lighting on something, I'll do a bigger section, light that, then lasso tool a smaller section within that and light that even more. Again, I recommend doing a lot of experimenting if you're gonna start using this kind of process, tweaking it and changing it to make it look the way you want your art to look. Anyway, that's about the end of our first layer of lighting, so we can move on to the final details and rim lighting. So even though I'm calling this section rim lighting, it's really rim lighting, final details, just all the last things I'm doing as I look at the piece and going, okay, what do I need to do to make this feel a bit more finished? But I do start with the rim lighting, and to do that, I make a new layer, change the blending mode to glow, or add, or whatever, something that's brightening things. I put it below the main layer of inks, as I have before, and then I just add a little bit of lighting around the edges of the character. And what that's kind of doing is replicating the look in real life where if you were looking at someone from the front and they were being heavily lit from the back. So you can't see most of the lighting on them, but you can see this little edge of lighting going around the sort of rim of their body. And that can really help a character stand out from the background. And the way I'm justifying it in this piece, which you don't always have to, you can do it just to make things look good sometimes, but I'm using that streak in behind them as justification for adding the rim lighting. And I'm not adding it in the same depth around the whole character. You can see when I'm adding it in a bit, there are some parts where I'll take the soft edge eraser and erase parts of it out to make it a little bit lighter. I don't want it too intense. I feel like I don't really need it that much to help the characters stand out. Their colors and everything else I've done in this piece is helping them pop out from the background enough. And then I'm also on that same layer just adding little bits of extra lighting detail where I want things popping a little bit more or adding a bit more depth to them, like some of the nuts and bolts kind of thing along Juggernaut's chest, or just wherever I think we could add a little bit of extra splash of bright light. And then finally, I'm making one more glow layer, but this one I'm putting on top of everything, even on top of the inks. And then I'm just brushing in a little bit of airbrushed lighting on some parts that I want to brighten up a little bit more. One of the spots specifically that I do here is Juggernaut's eyes. And this is a part of the art process where I'm not thinking about what would look realistic, I'm thinking about what would look good. For this piece, realistically, Juggernaut's eyes under that helmet would be so dark that you probably wouldn't be able to see them. And if I wanted to make him look more menacing, I probably would just darken out that eye area because eyes can be a comforting thing to look at, so if you can't see them at all, he's more menacing looking. But this isn't the kind of piece where I want it to look brooding and dark. I'm making it very vibrant and bright, and I want it to be a bit cartoony, and it's like a fun sort of fight scene. And that's probably a good note to end on. Just when you're doing something like coloring or art in general, just make sure you're not solely focusing on what would look realistic. It's no good to you if something looks realistic, but you don't like how it turned out. Anyway, that's a random weird note to end on, but we're coming down to the end of this piece, so let's take a look at how it turned out. I love these two characters, I love this fight, I love this drawing, I just love how this one turned out. And I hope it's working out for all of you. I'm planning on doing more tutorial kind of videos in the near future. I mean, I do lots of different kinds of videos, but if you do want a lot more coloring tutorial kind of videos, I highly, highly, highly recommend a channel called Color with Kurt. I'll link it in the tags and descriptions and whatever, but it's a really great channel. Most of the stuff that I've learned about coloring, I've learned from him. I'm still watching his videos and learning from him. I've done some of his paid courses, but he's got a lot of great free stuff on YouTube as well. It's so good for getting better at digital coloring. He's fantastic. Anyway, that's all from me for today. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It really helps boost up the algorithm, whatever. Leave whatever questions you want in the comments. I'm Christian Pearson. This has been Popcross Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye, everybody.